All right, we're going to talk about Pokemon design. So, design can be a variety of things. It can be physically what the Pokemon looks like. Is it a really cool thing? It can be its function in the game. Like, does it start a formula that Pokemon does? Is it the originator of a formula? Is it a really nice thing to have or an interesting combination? Does it fill a nice niche in the game of being like really powerful Pokemon or something to balance something else? So you can go a lot of different directions. Obviously, this is my opinion. I've discovered that for all the Pokemon in the world, there's a fan of that Pokemon. So if you like a Pokemon I don't like, then it's fine. I am going to say 10 I like, and not necessarily in order. 10 I really like in a generation, and 5 I don't like in a generation. Um, First generation, the first one, the original 151. I feel like they kind of get a pass. Like we're like, oh no, these are perfect. They're the first ones, and not all of them are perfect. A lot of them are like, this is just an animal that we've put in this game. It wouldn't be the only time it happened, or it's an animal and an element. Let's smush them together. Let's be honest, a lot of Pokemon are that, and that's a perfectly fine way to do it. Some of them are really, really cool. Some of them are like, not as cool. We'll go over them with time. So, 10 I really liked. Not necessarily in any particular order. I think all the starters in this generation do a really good job of being a cool thing in the end and being great examples of animal plus elements that really kind of articulates what they are with just looking at them. So all three of them are on this list. Venusaur, essentially a designed after a dinosaur with a plant on top. Looks really cool. Just kind of an effective design. Venusaur itself, having that poison type in the first generation was a little bit awkward. It couldn't really utilize poison attacks that well and did essentially just make it weak to psychic. I definitely had a playthrough where I had a Bulbasaur, and sometimes you wish Psychic wasn't as powerful as it was in the first generation. But with time, that poison typing made it a little bit better, especially with fairies. So I feel like its stature kind of grew in time. Charizard, what do I really have to say? It's a freaking dragon with a tail on fire, and it looks cool, and everybody loves it so much that it's the thing that's the most valuable of all the cards. It has all the cool different. It's got a cool shiny, for example. It's got a cool mega evolutions when it comes to what it looks like. It's just a nice, effective design. Uh, its typing definitely became more awkward when Stealth Rock was a thing, but this Charizard, what do you have to say? Blastoise, I feel like, is the forgotten one. It's not my favorite Pokemon. It's kind of hard to be the water Pokemon, I feel like, because you tend to always have good options for water Pokemon. But it was a good example in that first game of combining the natural, it's essentially a turtle, with the unnatural or the fantastical or the inorganic, which is the water cannons on its back. So it's kind of a cool combining of different elements. Fourth on my list is Pikachu slash Raichu. Pikachu is the symbol of the series, and everybody loves him. But it also was the start of a couple things that Nintendo and Game Freak would do over and over and over again in Pokemon games. So if it's the first example of a long line of things, it must have done something right. It is the first Pokemon really that you find in the game that's like a rare Pokemon in a particular area, one you would seek to find and catch in that area. So in Viridian Forest, it's like a pretty rare chance of seeing it, but it is a very cool Pokemon in that it is rare. It makes you go, oh man, what was that? Let me catch that. This would be repeated over and over and again through Pokemon, and this is kind of that first example. It's also the first example of an electric type early in the game. So electric type is usually useful, especially in that first game. If you did not pick Bulbasaur, was kind of your best bet of defeating Misty. Couldn't really take a hit from Misty, but it would help you out a little bit. And its chance of paralyzing something would also help you out there. So it's usually useful to have an early electric type in the game. And this was that first example of that. This Pokemon would have some cool stuff in the future when it comes to a different form with being psychic. So Everyone loves Pikachu. It's adorable. And was a great example for games to go forward. Poliwrath is also on my list. I just really like Poliwrath. The idea of frog, tadpole, wrestler, strongman, sumo wrestler thing is kind of fun combination of elements. There's a lot of water Pokemon in that first gen, but water fighting was kind of an interesting combination. Maybe not necessarily at that time, but kind of became a little more interesting going forward. Poliwrath is one of my personal favorites, so that might be putting him up here a little bit. But I hope at one point in time they will give Poliwrath more to do, because I feel like the power creep has kind of made Poliwrath a little irrelevant. But next on the list, Gengar. Kind of I guess you could say this is kind of a reference to all four of those Pokemon that you had to trade in order to get fully evolved. They were powerful Pokemon you can get early and also made you want to trade for them. So those are kind of cool design elements. Gengar himself is just a cool Pokemon. It's like a shadow. It was the only fully evolved ghost Pokemon in that first set, and kind of the only relevant one until Generation 3, and remained a kind of a glass cannon special attacker, fast attack thing throughout the entirety of its run in competitive play. Gengar's fun. There weren't a whole lot of. It was kind of in a weird position in the first gen because, yeah, it was useful against Alakazam, but there's no. It should have been. There wasn't really any ghost moves it could use at the time, so it ended up being a cool special attacker that wasn't affected by normal moves. Next, we got Gyarados and Magikarp. That first generation wasn't afraid to do some goofy things. Magikarp, it's kind of an iconic carp design anyway, inspired by Japanese art, I suppose you could say. But it's worthless, right? Like, you get it and you're like, what is this? Why would I even bother? And then, of course, it turns into this thing that's really, really cool looking and really useful. And I think still to this day is a pretty cool design for Gyarados. I wish they would do that more, just like random things that are new archetypes. Gyarados would kind of go on to inspire Melodic a little bit, but they didn't really do a whole bunch of those things. Next on the list, Eevee. Eevee's a really, really good idea for multiple reasons. One, it's cool to be able to pick your route of which you want to take, of what you want to take when you evolve Eevee. There's multiple different options, which is more options than anything else at the time, and still to this day with all the ways you can evolve it. Gameplay-wise, it was also a way to fill a spot on your team if you wanted. Like if you didn't have a good electric Pokemon, you could go with Jolteon. If you didn't have a good fire Pokemon, you can go with Flareon. Like it just gave you a way to patch holes in your team if you didn't like some of the other options that you had. None of these evolutions were probably the best example of a fire Pokemon. Like I don't think anyone's saying Flareon is the best fire Pokemon in the world. Vaporeon's pretty strong, but I don't think anyone's saying it's the best of that. So I feel like it was kind of like a balanced way to fill all those slots in your team. So Eevee's still a pretty popular Pokemon, especially considering all the ways you can go with it. And I'm always curious to see what a new Eevee would look like. Though I think at a certain point it probably becomes difficult to figure out the stats of new Eevees. Rounding out the list, we got Snorlax. Snorlax was another cool Pokemon, and that was like in your path, and it was this thing that started an archetype that they didn't follow through with all the way through, but its giant design that looks like something out of like a Miyazaki movie is fun, and might be inspired by something in Japanese culture. I'm not totally sure, but good example of a strong normal type Pokemon that it just looks cool. It's an iconic design. Final one on this list is Dragonite. I'm not the biggest fan of Dragonite, and at the time it seemed like it was kind of like an unbalanced thing to have, considering how Dragon was so strong at the time. It is kind of the one of the end bosses of the game, but it is the first example of, I mean, we call it a Dragonite, right? The first example of a late game, really strong 3-stage Pokemon that has really good stat totals, and that started here with Dragonite and would go on to be a niche filled by a whole bunch of different Pokemon that I like. So those are the good ones. I got Venusaur, Charizard, Blastoise, Pikachu / Raichu, Poliwrath, Gengar, Gyarados, and Magikarp, Eevee, Snorlax, and Dragonite. It was a little bit harder to fill out this list than I thought it was going to be. I do have some worse, though. Like I said, this game was the first one, so they could kind of get away with some stuff. And some of these things that I saw were pretty much just this is an animal, like seal is just a seal with the horn on its head. The example I used to sum up the creatures that just kind of look like a real world animal stuck in a video game is Krabby. Sometimes this happens with water Pokemon and sea creatures, just like, oh, it's just a manta or a crab or a seal or whatever. That was Krabby. There's a lot of water Pokemon, and it's just kind of a crab. You can't say it's super unique, even in its own generation. Like, yeah, it's got a higher attack, but at the end of the day, it's just a crab in an overrepresented type. So, Krabby on the list. Speaking of overrepresented types, speaking of the same overrepresented types, Seaking. I've never liked Seaking. It always seems like a worse version of other water Pokemon. It's just like filling up a slot that could have gone towards something else. I know it's got horn-based attacks, but it just seems like another water Pokemon. And I know there are fans of Seaking. I've learned that the hard way on this channel. There's also Rapidash. I feel like by the time you get to Rapidash in the game, it's pretty late game, and you already have other fire options. And I think at that point in time, you probably had Growlithe, Vulpix, Flareon. Obviously, you could have started with Charmander. Fire is a important type to have, in my opinion, but it's just kind of there. There are other options. In later games, this would be kind of the only option for Fire if you didn't have a starter, especially in Game 4. And it doesn't feel like you're playing with the best player that you could have had if this is your Fire Pokemon. So we also have Farfetch'd. There are a lot of one-and-done Pokemon in this game, and some of them are cool and interesting. And actually, Magmar, for another example, is something that you could have chosen instead of a Rapidash. But there's a bunch of one-and-done Pokemon that are interesting and strong. And then there is Farfetch'd. It is a normal flying Pokemon. You probably have a Pidgeot by this point in time. You could have had any of the legendary birds. And instead you got Farfetch'd. It would evolve in a much later game, but in this game it just kind of like pops out as like, why is this here? Its design is kind of interesting, and it's got a reference to something with Leek, but like, it's another, like, you had Pidgeot, you had Fearow, you got Dodrio, like, you got all the legendary birds. Do you need a Farfetch'd? So those are my worst. Seaking, Rapidash, Farfetch'd, Krabby. Oh, the fifth one. I almost forgot the fifth one. This one is less a bad Pokemon design and like what its typing is or its stats or whatever. More just the design part. It's Jynx. So you might notice Jynx goes from looking what Jynx originally looked like to being a very purple version of Jynx with maybe some less exaggerated facial features. That's because Jynx is a little bit too close to some unfortunate and outdated and frankly racist depictions of black people from an earlier time. It's not the only Japanese game or TV show or whatever that has gone down this route of depiction, but it was the one that got quickly changed in its design towards something much less offensive. So that's my worst. Seaking, Rapidash, Farfetch'd, Krabby, and Jynx. Join me for the second episode in this series where I talk about Gen 2, and I have some very clear opinions there.